Welcome to Conspiracist. Today, we're doing a deep dive into a really fascinating topic. The hypothesis that governments might have intentionally concealed evidence around the crop circle enigma.
Right.
Our goal here is to, objectively look at the evidence, the reasoning behind these claims. We're sticking to the sources, keeping it professional.
Absolutely. And right away, you notice the history around these formations is, well, it's long and kind of debated.
Like that old woodcut from the 1600s.
Exactly. The 1678 woodcut. Some people point to it as maybe the earliest depiction of a crop circle.
But it's not clear-cut, is it?
No, definitely not. Whether it's actually a first-hand account of that kind of phenomenon, that's very much still questioned. It could be folklore, allegory, something else entirely.
So even the earliest hint of evidence is, well, ambiguous. And this idea that the circles might be ancient, that pops up too, doesn't it?
It does. For some people involved in studying this, there's the belief they go way back, long before the modern sightings became frequent.
And when they did become more frequent, particularly in certain parts of England, what was the local reaction like?
Oh, it was quite something in some areas. You saw a real enthusiasm initially. Tourism picked up, people wanted to see them. Little businesses even started around it.
Interesting. But then there's the other side of the coin, the explanation that, well, maybe they aren't all mysterious. The hoax idea.
Right, and that really brings us to Doug Bauer and Dave Chorley. Their names are pretty central to that part of the story.
What did they claim exactly?
So their claim was that they started making crop circles back in 1976. And their method was surprisingly basic.
Yeah, how basic?
Just planks of wood, rope, maybe some wire. They focused on bending the stalks, not actually breaking them.
And they made quite a few.
They claimed over 200 patterns between 78 and 91. Then in 1991, they went public, confessed.
Was that just their word or?
No, a newspaper actually investigated and verified their ability to make one. It was a big moment. Though, importantly, they also said, lots of other circles weren't their work.
Okay, so that brings up an interesting point about terminology. Within the community, the sort of croppy culture, what does genuine versus hoax actually mean? It's maybe not what you'd first assume.
That's a really key distinction, yeah. For many within that subculture, a genuine circle isn't necessarily like confirmed alien or paranormal. It just means the origin is unknown. It's a mystery.
And a hoax is simply one that is known to be man-made.
Precisely. If someone made it, it's labeled a hoax within that framework, regardless of the skill or artistry involved.
So the people making the circles, how do they see their own work, if it's often labeled a hoax by others?
Well, many circle makers view it quite differently. They often see themselves as artists, creating land art. Sometimes it's tied into, New Age ideas, symbolic meanings, even ritual.
Provocative, collective, art that's meant to be open to interpretation.
Exactly. There's often this intentional ambiguity. The makers might not want to claim authorship immediately, letting the mystery linger. Both the creators and the interpreters, in a way, have an interest in keeping that sense of magic alive.
So openly admitting it's man-made can kind of deflate the phenomenon for some.
Right. It shifts the focus away from the mystery, which is central for many believers.
Let's shift focus slightly to where these circles were appearing. Was there a geographical pattern early on?
Oh, very much so. Initially, they were heavily concentrated in Hampshire and Wiltshire, in England. Time magazine even noted this back in 1989.
And Wiltshire already had a bit of a reputation, didn't it, related to unexplained things?
It did, yeah. Warminster in Wiltshire was known as a sort of UFO capital back in the 60s and 70s.
So the thinking is maybe that existing culture made it fertile ground for hoaxes to start and get linked to strange aerial stuff.
That's one theory, certainly, that the pre-existing interest in UFOs might have encouraged hoaxing, or at least the interpretation of circles as linked to UFOs.
But they didn't stay just in that area.
No, not at all. Dennis Pierce did an analysis showing the number of reported locations in England grew, well, faster than exponentially, a really rapid spread.
What about outside England?
Yes. By the late 80s, early 90s, reports started coming in internationally. You had cases in the U.S. in 1990, Missouri, Kansas, I believe, in sorghum fields. So it definitely went global as media attention grew.
Okay, so we have the hoax explanation, which gained a lot of traction with Bauer and Chorley. But what about other explanations? Natural causes, maybe?
People definitely look into that. There was G.T. Meaden's theory involving meteorological vortices, like natural whirlwinds pushing the crops down.
How well did that hold up?
It faced quite a bit of skepticism, actually, even from his own colleagues in meteorology. Apparently, those specific kinds of stable ground-level vortices aren't really a recognized weather phenomenon.
So natural weather explanations didn't seem to fully fit. What about other scientific approaches?
There was a group, the BLT research team, mostly based in the U.S. They proposed a geophysical theory, something about an ion plasma vortex interacting with the ground and the plants.
Plasma. Okay, that sounds more complex.
Yeah, they did analyses of plant and soil samples from circles, looking for anomalies, changes in cell structure, that sort of thing. They suggested their theory could account for many circles worldwide.
But has that gained mainstream acceptance?
That's the thing. Generally speaking, there hasn't been a lot of mainstream scientific research validating either Meaden's theory or the BLT team's plasma vortex idea. The phenomenon largely remains outside rigorous, widely accepted scientific study.
What about claims of weird properties inside the circles themselves, like unusual energy?
Yes, those claims are common. People talk about differences in energy levels in the grain inside versus outside. Dowsing is often used, which isn't scientifically validated, of course.
Wasn't there a story about the Earl of Haddington testing this?
Right, he was a cereologist. That's a term sometimes used for crop circle researchers. He apparently sent samples, blind, to a lab that claimed it could detect these energy differences.
What were the results?
Well, according to the reports, after a long wait, the lab basically said they couldn't provide results without knowing which samples came from inside the circles. So, inconclusive, really.
And radiation. I think I've heard claims about that, too.
Yes, back in '91, there was an article mentioning analysis by someone named Dudley. He reported finding elevated radiation levels in soil samples from circles. Levels, he argued, were unlikely to occur randomly.
Did he identify anything specific?
He speculated about possibly finding bismuth-207, which is an isotope not usually found just lying around in nature. But it was also noted that this was described as an unofficial project, and further analysis at a government lab faced potential delays. So, again, intriguing claims, but not definitively confirmed or widely replicated.
Okay, let's look at the patterns again, but from a different angle. There was a spatial analysis done using GIS, right? Geographic Information Systems.
Yes, Jeremy Northcote did that analysis for circles in England back in 2002, and his findings were quite striking.
What did he find?
He found a really strong tendency for crop circles to appear in places that are highly accessible.
Accessible how?
Close to major population centers, near main roads, also near cultural heritage sites, like ancient monuments. Places people go, places that are easy to get to and visible. His maps showed this quite clearly.
So definitely not randomly scattered across the landscape.
Not at all. He even quantified it with a frequency matrix, showing how many occurred in these high accessibility zones. The statistical probability of that distribution happening by chance was extremely low.
That's fascinating. Does that pattern remind researchers of anything else?
Yes, actually. Northcote drew a parallel with archaeological studies of things like megalithic tombs. Research suggests their locations were often chosen based on similar factors: visibility, proximity to settlements or routes, making them prominent landscape features.
So what does the spatial pattern tell us about how crop circles might be formed? Does it support one theory over others?
Well, it's interesting because it could potentially support different theories. For hoaxers, it makes perfect sense. You'd pick locations that minimize your travel time and maximize the chance of your work being seen. Easy access, high visibility.
Okay, that fits. What about non-human explanations?
Proponents of, say, extraterrestrial intelligence could argue that they would also choose visible, accessible locations near human populations to ensure their message, whatever it is, gets noticed.
I see. But does it argue against any particular theory?
It does seem to present a significant challenge for purely natural explanations, like the meteorological or plasma vortex theories.
Why is that?
Because natural phenomena like whirlwinds or plasma discharges wouldn't really care about roads or population density, would they? You wouldn't expect them to cluster near accessible places in such a non-random way. So the spatial pattern strongly suggests intentional placement, whether human or otherwise.
Okay, let's talk about some specific claims used to distinguish genuine from hoaxed circles. One is about tracks, right? That genuine ones appear without any marks.
That's a common claim, yeah. That there are no footprints, no vehicle tracks leading into the real ones.
But does the evidence support that?
Often, no. If you look closely at photographs, you can frequently see existing tractor lines, called tram lines, running into or through the formations. These are standard in agricultural fields and provide ready-made pathways.
So the idea of trackless entry isn't always accurate. What about the ability of researchers, these seriologists, to tell the difference? Can they reliably spot a hoax?
That's highly debatable. The criteria seem quite subjective. Dennis Stacy, writing for MUFON, pointed out that it often comes down to an investigator's sort of sixth sense or gut feeling rather than objective, measurable criteria.
So different researchers might look at the same circle and disagree on whether it's genuine.
Absolutely. That happens. It highlights the lack of a clear, objective standard for making that distinction.
Isn't there a famous story about Colin Andrews, a well-known researcher, being, well, fooled?
Yes, that anecdote comes up often. Apparently, a BBC film crew asked him to examine a circle they said was newly found. He reportedly declared it genuine. And then the BBC revealed they had commissioned people to make it specifically for the program. Andrews then apparently revised his assessment, saying it was perhaps too perfect. It just illustrates the difficulty.
What happens when people do confess to making circles? How is that received?
It's mixed. While lots of people have claimed responsibility over the years, their confessions are often doubted or dismissed by some believers. They might argue the confessed hoax doesn't explain all circles, or that the confessors couldn't possibly have made that specific complex pattern.
Yes, some confessions are accepted.
Sometimes. For example, Jenny Randalls and Paul Fuller, who wrote about the phenomenon, seem to accept the claim by 4 Cornish farmhands that they made a well-known formation back in 1986. So there's a degree of selective acceptance, perhaps.
Okay, final point. The plants themselves, bent versus broken stems, that's often cited as key, isn't it?
It is. The classic claim is that genuine circles have stems that are neatly bent, maybe at the nodes, but not snapped. Broken stems are seen as a sign of clumsy human hoaxing.
But is that distinction really so clear-cut?
Agronomists, people who actually study crops, point out that during the typical circle season in England, wheat is often still green and quite pliable. It can be bent quite easily without breaking, especially if there's dew present, which can make the stalks more flexible.
So bent stalks aren't necessarily mysterious.
Not necessarily. And conversely, broken stalks could simply indicate a less careful or less skilled hoaxer, or maybe conditions were drier. So both bent and broken stalks can arguably be explained without needing paranormal or unknown forces.
So when you look at all these threads, the history, the confessions, the geographical patterns, the attempts at scientific explanation, the specific claims about tracks and plants, it seems the evidence pointing towards human creation, at least for a large majority of circles, is quite substantial.
The evidence for human agency is certainly strong, especially considering the verified confessions, the methods demonstrated, and the spatial distribution analysis aligning with human accessibility patterns. Challenges remain for purely natural or other exotic explanations to account for these factors comprehensively.
Yet, the mystery endures for many people. What do you think keeps the enigma alive, even with explanations like Bauer and Shorley's?
Well, perhaps it's that inherent appeal of the unexplained. And the fact that Bauer and Chorley themselves said they didn't make all the circles leaves that door open for some. Plus, the visual power of the formations is undeniable. It taps into something, perhaps a desire for wonder or meaning beyond the everyday. How much proof is ever enough when belief offers something more compelling?
A fascinating question to ponder. Thanks for listening to Conspiracist.